Hi, it is Julian again from QSE Dynamics, and we are finally going to start looking at controlling risks. So we've done a lot of work to get to this point about identifying what we do, what a hazard is, how we're going to go about identifying them, what kind of tools we are going to use to assess risks. We can now finally start controlling them. So let's go through a few of the real key or important principles and a few tips and tricks that can really help in making this a successful risk control exercise for you. Of course, we do have to start with talking about the hierarchy of controls. It's probably something that is familiar to a number of us, but we will touch on those just to make sure that we are all on the same page. Also, when it comes to applying it, it will be more focused on some of the real key things to think about, because I think that there's a lot of information there on what these hierarchy of controls are and different application methods. So I'm trying to take a bit of a different spin on this. And so part of that different spin is going to be talking about some of the common mistakes when applying controls. I'm not going to go through the hierarchy of controls in deep detail or much at all, to be honest, given that there is just so much information out there. And I believe a lot of us will be familiar with the hierarchy of controls. Of course, if you're not, then I would really suggest having a deeper dive into these, because this really is the backbone of what we do in the field when we are looking at making sure our hazards and our risks for those hazards are adequately controlled. I will, however, point out the fact that the most or the more effective types of controls tend to be the least used, while the less effective are the most used. And this generally comes to how much easier it is to just purchase, let's say, some hearing protection instead of investigating how to reduce that noise from being hazardous. That's always a good example. I would really recommend challenging the norm and trying to help reverse this trend. It tends to be that we don't actually realize that we are picking the less effective controls. I know it's a very difficult thing to do, is trying to eliminate the hazards, but we really need to be challenging ourselves, challenging others within the business to try for better controls. And of course, we are doing this because we must control hazards to levels of acceptable risks. That is really important, that acceptable risks. I'll tie this in with what we looked at in the previous module when looking at risk rating tools, because we need to be able to understand and demonstrate this in a really clear way. In this first example, let's have a look to see if the risk controls implemented have been effective. And of course, we're going to rely on our risk rating tools to really guide us through this. So let's say in this case, you can think of any type of risk, maybe something that or hazard that you're looking at controlling, and put it in this scenario. Let's say before we've implemented any kind of control, we're getting a 23 extreme, so quite high. We are now looking at implementing a control, and afterwards we're getting a 21 extreme. So there's been a shift. But having a look at what extreme is, we're saying immediate action required, priority focus. It is telling us, our own tool is telling us that our control has not been effective in this case. Let's run another scenario. So let's say in this case, we have gone from a 23 extreme, and instead of to another extreme, we're now at an 18 high. So we have seen a reduction, but we need to not just say, well, okay, it's been reduced, therefore it has been effective. We have to consider, well, is this fully or partially effective? Maybe we're at the point where we can say, okay, we have taken some kind of action to reduce the risk, But we still need to consider if that 18 high is the best we can do, if that is acceptable. It's really up to the situation. I mean, some things, as much as you'll try and reduce it, will always have a quite high level of risk. For example, confined space work. You'll never have that as a low risk. There's always going to be significant risk associated with that. So do have a look at your residual risk controls and really determine, well, is this something that we need to continue working on, or based on the situation, the scenario, the type of work, we can't say that this is of a lower risk? Because of course we don't want to say that something is a lower risk when it is a higher risk, because that way we may not be able to bring it to management attention, get the types of resources we need to make sure that we have the right training, licensing, permit processes in place to really make sure that that hazard is appropriately addressed. And then let's say we actually do get it from a high to a medium. Again, depending on what it is, you may think it's either fully or partially effective. If you have gone from, let's say, that extreme down to your high and then managed to even get it to a medium, I think it's probably a really good show of how you've been able to implement risk controls. And again, depending on what the activity is, you may not be able to get it bumped down any further just because of the inherent risks associated with the works. So always think about that residual risk score. Is that enough? Is it okay for now as a temporary control while we continue to investigate more long-term controls? Or is it at a point where we can say that yes, we have done what we can possibly do given the type of work that's being completed? And now let's quickly go through a few of the common mistakes that tend to pop up during the risk control process. One of them is applying controls which do not really impact that residual level of risk. So we did have a bit of that example where we had something that was extreme and then it was going to another level of extreme, a little bit lower, but it really didn't hit the mark. So another example is conducting a once-off toolbox. You're warning your workers that there are fall hazards in the workplace. I would say that this does not classify as a sufficient control in itself. The truth of the matter is the hazards are still there. You haven't gone through that proper hierarchy. You've picked a one-off administration control when in reality fall hazards are very high risk and you should be looking much further up the hierarchy of controls. So if you were to see this as the control method and then a lower risk rating, I would really question that and really push to make sure that people understand why this is not an effective control. Another common one is going straight to PPE as a control. So we do know that from the hierarchy of controls, we do deem this as the least effective type, but the most used. And so a number of reasons why this can be a particular problem is, firstly, it is very difficult to get consistent compliance. Typically, when it comes to things such as hearing protection, eye protection, you will see a mixed level of compliance. It has to be worn, replaced and serviced correctly. A good example is face masks. Disposable ones tend to hang around longer than they should. When it comes to reusable face masks, you do tend to see that they're not stored correctly, that the filters are out of date. You do need a proper maintenance program and also a training program to make sure that they're worn correctly. So buying PPE can come with a whole range of different tasks that need to be associated with it. Their effectiveness is also limited by the capabilities of the PPE. Another good example is respirators. A lot of them are rated for different types of contaminants. And also, just because it's rated for that contaminant doesn't mean that it can handle the amount of contaminants that it is getting. They may end up being clogged, their performance reduced, again, matched with not being worn or serviced correctly. It really gives a false sense of being protected at times, when in reality the performance may be greatly reduced. And of course, the hazard is well and truly still within the workplace. The hazard hasn't been removed, you're just learning to live with that hazard. When that happens, people get used to it, it becomes the norm. People just accept it as being part of the occupation. So it's really it's a good tool. I don't want to say that PPE doesn't have its place. It certainly does, but it really isn't the go-to for each and every hazard. Another common mistake is not determining if a control that has been implemented has just resulted in a hazard being shifted or creating unexpected ones. And in all honesty, this has happened to me a number of times where I've thought that I've implemented something that has controlled a hazard, only to find out later that, well, it's actually shifted somewhere else. And it's really helped me expand my knowledge and my ability to find proper solutions by thinking of the bigger picture. So let's go through a few of those examples. So let's say you've changed something in relation to traffic management. So the forklift traffic flow, it's been changed to reduce the amount of congestion in the warehouse. You've noticed that people are coming into close proximity, it's looking a bit crowded, so you change the flow of traffic, but you've done this and it leads to unidentified collision hazards in another area. Perhaps it wasn't an area that you were seeing as accessed during the assessment, or you didn't know was being accessed. You've talked to people, they've thought that it would be okay, but upon doing the change, they've also realized that it's not ideal. It's one of those things that can occur quite a bit with traffic management. Whenever making changes, make sure that you monitor those changes really closely. And another example, let's say you have implemented a pallet lifter. So this is used to help control some manual handling issues you've identified. But what has occurred is that it's actually being used on an uneven surface. So it may cause the pallet lifter to tip, or the contents on the pallet lifter to tip. Now this one is probably more of an extreme example. You would really want to be able to assess this as a potential hazard prior to implementing a control, but who knows, maybe they've decided to set up somewhere that wasn't part of the assessment, or there was a whole packing line, for example, that you didn't know existed, and that's where it's going to be used. Just make sure that you have a really good understanding of the different environments that a piece of equipment may be used in, particularly if it is something that is mobile. And in this last example, let's say there is a worker who conducts sanding activities. It creates a lot of dust, so the idea has been brought up to move it to a purpose-built shed that gets done, and there's adequate dust extraction. However, now they're actually working in isolation all day. So if something were to happen to that worker, nobody would be there to assist or identify that the person may need a first aid, for example. So again, we've managed to control a certain aspect of the hazard, but we aren't necessarily controlling all the hazards associated with that work. So how can we actually improve the success of our controls? As we've seen, there can be a range of things that can be unintended consequences following the implementation of controls. We're trying our best. We always mean well, of course, but sometimes we need to revisit those controls, or better yet, avoid applying the wrong controls in the first place. Make sure that you directly consult with workers who are directly doing the work. Also, you can run a lot of what if scenarios or almost be the devil's advocate just to make sure that everyone understands the pros and cons of the suggestions being raised. Reevaluate risks before implementing the proposed control. So you can pretend that you have implemented it and then do a mock risk assessment. And of course, once you have actually implemented the control, you should be reevaluating the risks too. Try and seek equipment on trial before committing to large types of expenditures. Sometimes you will see a potential engineering solution online. It looks great. You get it in, and then you do find that for whatever reason, it may not suit the application. A lot of manufacturers and suppliers will be more than happy to provide you something on trial for free, and you can see if that does suit the business. And also make sure that you really do understand the level of risk. So when you do implement controls, they can be in proportion. You don't want to underdo it, but of course you don't want to overdo it as well. It has to be practicable for the type of risk. So these are just a few ways. I'm sure there's plenty more, and I'm always learning in this space. I'm always finding new ways of helping implement more effective controls, and it's probably one of those things that really keeps me excited about this space. So let's finish off by having a look at the risk register that we've been building throughout this series. And now we have our residual risk rating. Initially, we just had the primary ones. We had put in some controls, but now we've come back and we've actually given it a rating. So let's look at the use of forklifts. We have gone from a 24 extreme to a 17 high. Now that's good that we have seen some kind of reduction. So can we do more should be the question. It may be that we've just determined that, well, this is going to be one of our high risk activities. We'll have to continually monitor it and make sure our controls are adequately implemented. That may be the case, but we do have to ask that question. Can we do more? So we'll talk about more about how we can review these in the next part of the series where it's reviewing controls. Packing line, we've seen that go from an 18 high to a 9 medium. So that is good. We've seen those controls reduce those risks, so we can continually monitor that and see if there's any more opportunities to reduce that, but we at least know that it's not a particular priority. The paint line's gone from an 18 high to a 10 medium, so it's in the same situation as the packing line. And then we have our cleaners. So the controls, we've done some training on manual handling. We've reminded them of where the first aid kits are. As a result, we haven't really implemented controls that have reduced the residual risk rating. So in this case, we should do more. I don't think it's even a question. We can look at that and say that, well, these controls have not been effective. So there's 3 examples of one control which looks like there has been some effective controls put into place, but we can of course check if we can do more. We have 2 hazards that we can see have been reduced, and it looks like we can potentially be happy with that and just continually monitor that, look for opportunities if we can find them. And then lastly, for the cleaners, we can see that controls just haven't gone far enough. So we can use this now to start prioritizing where we should be putting our resources in managing those hazards and getting suitable risks, or risk control scores rather. And that is it for part 4. So what will happen is the last part will be released in about a week's time. They are set on this weekly schedule that I am really trying to keep to, but of course things do get busy. And in the meantime, feel free to get in touch if you have any comments, questions, or if you would like some help within your business in implementing quality, safety, or environmental management systems. Thanks.